Turnen, James Bond, was inspired by real spies. It might surprise you to learn that James Bond, the suave MI6 agent with a license to kill, didn't come entirely from Ian Fleming's imagination. Fleming himself had spent years working in British naval intelligence during World War II. He wasn't the kind of man who parachuted into enemy territory or shot villains on mountain tops, but he was deeply involved in high-level strategy and planning. He worked on operations that were just as daring as any Bond mission. For instance, he helped mastermind Operation Mincemeat, a deception plan that tricked the Nazis into moving their forces away from Sicily, saving countless Allied lives. But here's the thrilling part. Fleming borrowed heavily from real spies and soldiers he encountered. There was a Serbian double agent named Dusan Popov, nicknamed Tricycle. Popov was a notorious playboy who drank heavily, gambled with reckless abandon, and charmed women everywhere he went. Sound familiar? That's because Popov was essentially living the Bond lifestyle before Bond was even written. Popov even strolled into a Las Vegas casino in 1941 with $50,000 of British intelligence money, placed it all on the roulette table, and laughed as jaws dropped around him. Fleming himself witnessed this wild gamble and later adapted the idea into the iconic casino scene in Casino Royale. And Popov wasn't the only influence. A Canadian spy master named Sir William Stevenson, nicknamed Intrepid, served as another major inspiration. Stevenson was deeply involved in setting up British-American intelligence cooperation during the war, basically laying the foundation for the CIA. He was mysterious, brilliant, and ruthlessly effective. Fleming once said that James Bond was a compound of all the secret agents and commando types I met during his service, but he admitted Stevenson stood out above all others. So, while James Bond might appear fictional, his DNA is stitched together from the real heroes and rogues of the shadowy world of wartime espionage. This is what gives Bond that strange credibility. No matter how outrageous his adventures get, there's always that tiny voice whispering, maybe, just maybe, someone like this really existed. 9. The name, James Bond, came from the least glamorous source imaginable. When you hear the name James Bond, it rolls off the tongue with this perfect balance of strength and mystery. But here is the twist. It didn't beg it come from some secret code book or a high-level intelligence file. Ian Fleming actually borrowed the name from an American ornithologist. That's right. James Bond, the man of action, danger, and romance, was named after a quiet bird expert from Philadelphia. Fleming was an avid birdwatcher in his free time, especially in Jamaica, where he owned a retreat called Goldeneye. On his shelf was a book titled Birds of the West Indies by James Bond, the ornithologist. Fleming later admitted he wanted his hero to have the simplest, dullest, plainest-sounding name he could think of. To him, James Bond sounded blunt, strong, and totally unremarkable, exactly the kind of cover name a spy would want. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't exotic, it was just ordinary. And yet, in one of those bizarre twists of history, that ordinary name transformed into the most iconic spy identity in the world. Imagine being James Bond, the bird guy, and suddenly finding your name splashed across billboards, posters, and movie screens worldwide. In fact, the real James Bond and his wife once visited Fleming in Jamaica, and they found the whole thing hilarious. Fleming even offered to let the ornithologist use the name Ian Fleming for anything he might publish in return. Think about how strange this is. The name that now symbolizes fast cars, femme fatale, and espionage at the highest stakes was taken straight off a dusty field guide about Caribbean birds. It's like naming the world's most dangerous assassin after your local librarian. And yet that's part of the magic of Bond. Fleming understood that the dullness of the name gave him freedom. Because Bond's name wasn't remarkable, his deeds could be legendary. This choice also tells us something about the genius of Fleming's writing. He deliberately avoided making Bond sound like a superhero. Instead, he created a man who blended in, who could walk through a crowd without raising suspicion. That contrast between an ordinary name and extraordinary actions is part of why Bond has endured. Yerk 8, the first Bond film. Almost didn't happen today. It feels like the James Bond movies have always been a part of cinema history. They're the longest continuously running film series ever, spanning decades and billions of dollars in revenue. But here's the crazy truth. The very first film, Dr. No, 1962, almost didn't get made. Back in the late 1950s, Ian Fleming's novels were popular in Britain, but they weren't the massive global sensation we think of now. When producers Harry Saltzman and Albert R. Cubby Broccoli decided to bring Bond to the big screen, studios weren't convinced audiences would care. American studios, in particular, thought the books were too British. Others worried that the Cold War themes would feel outdated or controversial. One executive even said, "This will never work. Who wants to watch a story about an English spy?" But Saltzman and Broccoli pushed forward. They bought the rights and scraped together just $1 million for the budget. Tiny, even by 1960s standards. To put it in perspective, Lawrence of Arabia, released the same year, cost $15 million. That meant the Bond producers had to cut corners everywhere. They couldn't afford big stars, so they turned to a relatively unknown Scottish actor named Sean Connery. They couldn't afford exotic locations, so they shot most of Dr. No in Jamaica. Even the now iconic opening gun barrel sequence was born out of necessity. The producers wanted something cheap yet stylish to kick off the film. The result? A simple graphic of a gun barrel paired with that unforgettable Bond, James Bond introduction. When Dr. No premiered, critics were skeptical, but audiences were electrified. Connery's mix of charm and menace was unlike anything people had seen. The low-budget gamble paid off spectacularly, and suddenly James Bond was a household name. It's wild to think how fragile that beginning was. If Saltzman and Broccoli hadn't taken a chance, or if Dr. No had flopped, there would be no Aston Martins, no Q gadgets, no Daniel Craig running across rooftops in Casino Royale. One hesitant studio executive nearly robbed us of a 60-year cinematic legacy. Instead, Bond exploded onto the scene and redefined action movies forever. Sir 7. The iconic gadgets came from real military tech. One of the things that makes James Bond unique is his arsenal of gadgets. From exploding pens to invisible cars, Bond always has some cutting-edge toy from Q Branch to get him out of trouble. But here's the fascinating part. Many of those gadgets were inspired by real military technology. During World War II, intelligence agencies were obsessed with creating disguised weapons and tools. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, sometimes called Churchill's Secret Army, developed things like pens that fired bullets, hollow coins that carried microfilm, and even rats stuffed with explosives meant to sabotage German factories. Some of these ideas worked, others sounded like they came straight out of a comic book. Ian Fleming knew about these devices because of his wartime work in naval intelligence. He had a front-row seat to some of the most bizarre inventions ever attempted. When he sat down to write Bond's adventures, he simply turned up the volume. Suddenly, exploding cigarette cases and cars with ejector seats didn't seem so far-fetched. They felt like natural extensions of wartime spycraft. The film producers took this and ran with it. Q, the grumpy gadget master, became one of the most beloved characters in the franchise. His workshop was essentially a showcase of spy tech imagination, but it always had a kernel of truth. For instance, in Goldfinger, Bond's Aston Martin DB5 came equipped with revolving license plates, machine guns hidden in the headlights, and a passenger ejector seat. Sounds wild, right? But military vehicles at the time were already being outfitted with concealed weapons and defensive tricks. The filmmakers just made it sleek and glamorous. Some Bond gadgets even predicted the future. In From Russia with Love, 1963, Bond uses a pager-like device years before such technology became mainstream. In Thunderball, 1965, he dons a rebreather for underwater breathing that looked like science fiction at the time, but foreshadowed advances in scuba technology. Even the fingerprint scanner in Diamonds Are Forever, 1971, was decades ahead of everyday reality. This blending of fact and fiction is part of what makes Bond irresistible. Audiences could suspend disbelief because they sensed these gadgets weren't entirely impossible. They came from a lineage of real-world ingenuity born out of wartime necessity. That's why every time Q rolls his eyes at Bond for misusing equipment, we lean in. We know we're about to glimpse the edge of what S real and what S fantastical. And here's the kicker. These gadgets weren't just fun gimmicks. They influenced how viewers imagined the future of technology. Tech companies even admitted later that Bond movies inspired their designs. It's not an exaggeration to say that Bond shaped not just pop culture but innovation itself. Figure 6. Sean Connery wasn't the first choice for Bond. It's almost impossible to imagine anyone other than Sean Connery as James Bond in those early films. His rugged good looks, his Scottish charm, the way he could deliver a line like Bond, James Bond with effortless cool, it defined the character for generations. But here's the twist. Sean Connery wasn't the producer's first choice. In fact, he wasn't even close. When Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman started casting for Dr. No, they considered a laundry list of actors. The top contender at first was Cary Grant, one of the most famous stars of Hollywood's golden age. Grant had the sophistication and the charm, but he was already in his late 50s and didn't want to commit to multiple films. He would only agree to one, and the producers needed someone willing to sign on for a series. Other names floated around included David Niven, who later played Bond in the parody version of Casino Royale, 1967, and even Richard Burton. Some reports suggest they also looked at Patrick McGoohan, a British actor known for Danger Man, who turned it down because he disliked the role's womanizing. In other words, the man who could have been Bond thought the character was morally questionable. So how did Sean Connery land the part? Broccoli's wife, Dana, played a huge role. She reportedly told her husband that Connery had the raw masculinity and physical presence the role needed. When Connery walked into a room, he owned it. He wasn't polished like Grant, but he had a dangerous edge. That was exactly what Bond required. The producers decided to give Connery a makeover, literally. They sent him to a tailor, a barber, and even etiquette lessons to polish his rough edges. By the time cameras rolled, Connery was transformed into the suave agent we know today. Ironically, Ian Fleming himself didn't like Connery at first. He thought the Scotsman was too unrefined for his creation. But after seeing Dr. No, Fleming changed his tune so completely that he rewrote Bond's backstory in later novels to include Scottish heritage, just to match Connery. That's how much of an impact Connery had on the role. And the rest is history. Connery not only became the face of Bond, but also turned into a global superstar. Without him, the franchise might never have taken off. It's wild to think that the man now synonymous with 007 was initially considered too rough around the edges to play him. Sometimes, the best choice isn't obvious. It's the one who transforms the role itself. Figure 5. The Bond theme song has a controversial history. Few pieces of music are as instantly recognizable as the James Bond theme. The moment those surf guitar notes hit, you know you're in for action, intrigue, and danger. But behind this legendary piece of music lies a tangled web of controversy over who really deserves credit. The theme was officially credited to Monty Norman, a British composer hired to work on Dr. No. Norman claimed that he adapted the melody from a song he had written for a failed stage musical called A House for Mr. Biswas. He slowed it down, gave it a darker edge, and voila, the Bond theme was born. But here's where things get complicated. John Barry, a young composer brought in to arrange and orchestrate the piece, transformed Norman's melody into the version we know today. Barry used his jazz background to add those dramatic brass hits and iconic guitar riff, making the theme sleek, dangerous, and unforgettable. Audiences immediately associated Barry with the sound of Bond. Over time, Barry went on to compose scores for 11 Bond films, shaping the franchise's entire musical identity. From Goldfinger to You Only Live Twice, Barry's sweeping orchestrations became just as essential as the gadgets or the villains. Fans and critics alike began to assume he had written the original theme as well. Norman, however, held on to the official credit and royalties. This led to decades of legal battles and heated debates. Norman even sued newspapers for libel when they suggested Barry was the real creator. Courts consistently sided with Norman, but the public often sided with Barry. It became one of the most famous authorship controversies in film history. Regardless of who deserves the most credit, the Bond theme is a masterpiece. It's not just background music, it's part of Bond's identity. That slinky guitar suggests seduction, the blaring brass screams danger, and the rhythm pulses like adrenaline. It's the sound of sophistication colliding with violence, perfectly capturing who James Bond is. Think about how many films have tried to copy it. Spy parodies, action thrillers, even commercials have borrowed from its vibe. None ever match the original. That has the power of a theme that has lived in the cultural bloodstream for over 60 years. And here's a fun detail. When Americans first heard the theme in theaters, many thought it sounded revolutionary. In reality, it was just as influenced by American surf rock as it was by British jazz. In a way, the Bond theme represents the exact transatlantic blend that made the films so globally appealing. Whether you give the credit to Norman, Barry, or some mix of the two, one fact is undeniable. Without that music, James Bond would never have become the same icon. The theme turned him from a character into a myth. It's the soundtrack of danger, and it never gets old. The Carrefour, James Bond, nearly switched to television. It might sound shocking today, but there was a time when James Bond's future seemed destined for the small screen, not the big one. Before Dr. No launched the cinematic empire in 1962, producers toyed with the idea of turning Bond into a television character. Imagine if 007 had debuted in grainy black and white, squeezed into half-hour episodes, instead of the sweeping widescreen adventures we know today. In the mid-1950s, CBS actually purchased the rights to Casino Royale, Fleming's very first Bond novel. They produced a live TV adaptation in 1954 with American actor Barry Nelson playing Jimmy Bond, an American agent working for Combined Intelligence. Instead of the suave British spy we know, Nelson's version felt like a generic detective show. The villain, Le Chiffre, was still there, but the atmosphere lacked the exotic flair and sophistication of Fleming's writing. The broadcast was largely forgotten for decades, overshadowed by the later films. But this experiment almost killed Bond before he had a chance to shine. If audiences had latched onto that cheap TV version, studios might never have bothered with the movies. Instead, it was treated as a curiosity, something that showed potential but hadn't found the right formula yet. What's fascinating is that Fleming himself was desperate for Bond to break into visual media. He even wrote a series of short stories in the late 1950s intended as scripts for a proposed Bond TV show. Those stories later became the basis for the collection For Your Eyes Only. Fleming knew that to make Bond a global icon, he had to move beyond the page. Television seemed the obvious step at the time, but fate intervened. The low-budget TV Bond flopped, and Hollywood wasn't interested, until Broccoli and Saltzman came along. That failure gave them the creative freedom to reinvent Bond properly for the cinema. Looking back, it's almost lucky that Bond didn't become a TV character first, because if he had, he might never have carried the mystique, scale, and glamour that the big screen gave him. Instead of globe-trotting adventures filled with gadgets and luxury, we might have ended up with a second-rate detective show that faded into obscurity. The irony. Decades later, Bond's influence would circle back to television. Shows like Mission Impossible, The Man from UNCLE, and even Alias owed huge debts to Bond's cinematic reinvention. In other words, Bond didn't just escape being stuck on TV. He reshaped it from afar. 3. James Bond almost got Americanized. Here's another wild what if. After the novels started gaining traction in the United States, Hollywood grew interested, but they weren't convinced an English spy would appeal to American audiences. So what was their solution? Simple. Make Bond American. That's exactly what CBS did in the 1954 Casino Royale TV version, where Jimmy Bond became an American agent. They stripped him of his British roots, his MI6 background, and much of his sophistication. The idea was that U.S. viewers wouldn't connect with a posh British secret agent. And it wasn't just television executives thinking this way. When Broccoli and Saltzman were pitching Dr. No, some Hollywood distributors suggested changing Bond into an American CIA operative. After all, America was dominating the film industry, and studios believed global audiences would follow American heroes more easily. But Broccoli and Saltzman fought back. They understood that Bond's identity as a British agent wasn't a minor detail. It was the core of the character. His mannerisms, his wit, his connection to Britain's post-imperial identity, all of it depended on him being distinctly British. Take that away and you just have another generic spy. Can you imagine Bond without the dry humor, the Queen's English accent, the references to London and MI6? He'd lose the very elements that made him unique. The producers held firm, and history proved them right. Far from being too British, Bond became a global sensation precisely because of his identity. The tuxedos, the mannerisms, even the way he ordered his martini, it all radiated a coolness that people everywhere wanted to emulate. Of course, Bond did absorb some American influence along the way. The films leaned heavily into U.S. settings and characters to ensure mass appeal. Felix Leiter, Bond's CIA ally, was created partly to provide an American counterpart audiences could relate to, and many of the film's premieres were deliberately staged to conquer the American market first. Still, the fact remains, Bond stayed British, and that decision preserved his mystique. Instead of blending into the crowd of American action heroes, Bond stood apart. He became the ultimate export, a uniquely British icon that the whole world claimed as their own. It's one of those sliding door moments in pop culture. If Bond had been Americanized early on, he might have ended up just another forgotten spy character. Instead, by staying true to his roots, he became timeless. 2. The stunts are realer than you think. When people think of James Bond, they think of action, heart-pounding chases, impossible escapes, and stunts that make you wonder if anyone actually survived filming them. What many don't realize is that a surprising number of those stunts were performed for real, with minimal CGI. Bond movies built their reputation on pushing physical limits. Take The Spy Who Loved Me, 1977, for example. The opening ski jump off a cliff in the Alps remains one of the most iconic stunts in film history. Stuntman Rick Sylvester actually launched himself off Mount Asgard in Canada, free-falling thousands of feet before opening a Union Jack parachute. No green screens, no digital tricks, just raw courage. Audiences in theaters gasped because it looked impossible. And it was, almost. Or consider Casino Royale, 2006. Daniel Craig's parkour chase across cranes and construction sites wasn't just clever editing. The stunt team really scaled those heights, sprinted across beams, and leapt between crane-suspended stories above the ground. The danger was real, the sweat was real, and that authenticity bleeds onto the screen. Even earlier films kept things brutally physical. In Octopussy, 1983, stuntman Martin Grace clung to the side of a speeding train for a sequence. He miscalculated a concrete pole and smashed into it, suffering severe injuries, but he insisted on returning to finish the stunt weeks later. That's the kind of dedication that made Bond action sequences legendary. The franchise also became famous for setting records. The Man with the Golden Gun, 1974, featured a car doing a 360-degree corkscrew jump across a river, the first stunt of its kind, mathematically calculated with computers to ensure the car would land upright. The stunt team nailed it in one take. Years later, Casino Royale set a Guinness World Record for the most cannon rolls in a car crash, flipping an Aston Martin 7 times down a road. These aren't just stunts. They're part of Bond's DNA. The audience expects the impossible, but what makes it exciting is that the impossible often turns out to be real. In a world where action movies today rely heavily on CGI, Bond stands apart by clinging to the thrill of real danger. And that's why every time 007 jumps off a building, crashes a plane, or fights on top of a train, you can't look away. Number 1. James Bond is the most profitable spy in history. Let's talk numbers. James Bond isn't just a cultural icon, he's an economic powerhouse. Since Dr. No premiered in 1962, the franchise has grossed over $7 billion at the global box office, making it one of the highest-earning film series ever. That doesn't even include merchandise, product placements, or the tourism booms that follow every new Bond location. Here's how big Bond is. Aston Martin, a car brand that was nearly bankrupt in the early 1990s, saw its sales skyrocket after featuring prominently in GoldenEye, 1995, and later Casino Royale. Omega watches turned their Bond partnership into a global status symbol, with sales soaring every time 007 strapped one on his wrist. Even Heineken shelled out tens of millions to have Bond swap his martini for a beer in Skyfall, 2012. And Bond isn't just making money for companies, he's shaping entire economies. The tourism industry in places like Thailand, Jamaica, and Scotland saw dramatic increases after appearing in Bond films. The James Bond Island in Thailand, featured in The Man with the Golden Gun, is now one of the country's top tourist attractions, drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. Jamaica, home to Fleming's GoldenEye estate and filming location for multiple movies, built an entire cottage industry around Bond tourism. The franchise also proved the power of global marketing. Bond was one of the first film series to think internationally. Producers carefully planned premieres in London, New York, and Tokyo, ensuring simultaneous worldwide hype. That strategy became the playbook for Hollywood blockbusters today. And then there's the longevity. Few franchises survive more than a decade without burning out. Bond has thrived for over 60 years, adapting with each era. Sean Connery gave us the Cold War spy. Roger Moore gave us campy fun. Pierce Brosnan delivered slick, tech-savvy 1990s action. Daniel Craig brought gritty realism and emotional depth. Each reinvention kept the money flowing and the legend alive. James Bond is more than a fictional spy. He's a brand, a symbol, and a financial juggernaut. No other spy character has ever come close to his level of cultural and economic impact. That's why when people say the name's Bond, James Bond, they are not just quoting a character, they re-invoking one of the most profitable icons in entertainment history. Bond's world is filled with paradoxes. A spy born from wartime shadows became the brightest star in cinema. A dull name borrowed from a birdwatcher turned into the most glamorous alias on Earth. A low-budget gamble in 1962 grew into a multi-billion-dollar empire. The gadgets, the stunts, the music, they all shaped not just movies, but culture itself. And that's what makes these facts so electrifying. James Bond isn't just entertainment. He's a mirror of history, technology, business, and fantasy, all wrapped in a tuxedo. He reflects our fears, our desires, and our constant need for heroes who can walk into danger and come out smoother than before. So, the next time you watch Bond sip his martini, remember, behind every scene lies a story even stranger than fiction. That's why, more than 60 years later, we're still watching, still fascinated, and still waiting for that line that sends chills down our spine. Bond. James Bond.